I'm Dr. Juan Valdes, and I want to talk to you today about God, God's existence, the case for theism. And so, arguments for God's existence usually come in multiple flavors. So if you like one, you can use that one better than another. There are three classical arguments that I really like, and I think those are the ones that are most effective. And I want to share those with you today. Okay, there are more than three, obviously, but the three that we're going to focus on are called the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the axiological argument. Those sound really like complicated words, and they are. They're very technical. Let me make it easier for you. We're going to be talking about the argument from creation, cosmos, the universe, creation. We're going to be talking about the argument from design, telos. And we're going to be talking about the argument from morality, axios. And so these are the arguments that you would be able to use to respond to the question, how do you know God exists? Because oftentimes we are confronted with that question. And the people that confront us with that question do not believe that the Bible is God's word. They don't believe God exists. They don't believe Christians are right. So if your evidence that God exists is a verse out of the Bible, yes, that is true. Yes, we know that confirms God's existence because it's His word. But to somebody who doesn't believe the Bible is God's word, what you're giving them is meaningless. It's as if we quoted Shakespeare or Moby Dick or Hamlet. It's meaningless to somebody. It's not an authoritative document to them. So we need arguments, rational arguments, where we use logic and common sense as a bridge that connects us with our skeptical friend or the person with whom we're having this dialogue. So let me give you these arguments. I'm going to start with my favorite. My favorite is the design argument because it's so simple and so powerful. It's in the form of a deductive argument, which means that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to follow, has to be true. Let me explain this. I think it'll make sense as we go. First premise of this argument is that every design implies a designer. All designs imply a designer. That is not even controversial. Think about it. If you're in this building right now or wherever you are, look around you. Do you believe honestly that where you're at is the product of an explosion of a Home Depot? Of course not. You're living in, or right now you're sitting in a building that was designed. There's electrical design, there's plumbing design, there's flooring design, lighting design. Everything is designed. So whenever you see a design, there has to be a designer. Whenever you see a watch, there has to be a watchmaker. And it's common sense. To me, it's an undeniable premise. Then you have your second premise, that the universe has a great design. There really is a great design in the universe. So think about it. If every design implies a designer, there is a great design in the universe, what conclusion can you draw from that? The only possible conclusion is that there is a great designer of the universe. So this argument is very simple. Memorize it. Every design implies a designer. The universe has a great design, therefore the universe has a great designer. Done. Now, to make this really effective, it helps if we're able to provide examples. Examples of design. Examples where it is obvious that what we are looking at and what we are trying to comprehend cannot possibly be the result of random, unguided processes, but rather the design of a very intelligent designer. And so let me give you some examples from different fields of science. And I recommend you become familiar with an example in whatever field of science you like. Find one good example of design. I will also mention some of the counter arguments or some of the possible responses you might have to deal with, and I'll tell you how to deal with them, because this is, to me, an irrefutable argument. So let me give you some examples. Let's start with our atmosphere, examples of God's design cosmologically, okay? So our atmosphere is not just a random collection of chemicals and elements. It's not. It's a very precise combination, a very precise mixture of elements. You have exactly 20% oxygen, 79% nitrogen. You have 0.03 carbon dioxide, 0.04% water, 0.03 of various other elements combined. Now, if any of those measurements vary, however slightly they vary, it severely affects the ability for there to be life on Earth. It could be mortal. So what are the odds that a random, unguided process happened to trap within the atmosphere of a particular rock just the right elements for us to be able to breathe, for plants to be able to breathe, for animals to be able to breathe? And not only is there a balance in the exact measurements of these elements, but there's a system to keep that balance. See, when we inhale oxygen, but we exhale carbon dioxide. So if there is no system in place to keep a balance of these chemicals or these elements, we could very easily lose that balance and perish. But no, there are systems in place. There's photosynthesis and other systems in place to assure that this is the right balance that is maintained throughout human history. And so that, you can ask yourself, is that something that happened by chance or by design? I'm sorry, but common sense tells me this happened by design, not by chance. Let's look at another example. Let's look now at the atomic level. Let's look at chemistry, but very basic chemistry. What is the most basic element in chemistry? It's the atom. Everything has to do with the atom, the protons and neutrons and the electrons and how they interact with each other in different elements of the periodic table. So what is an atom? The Greek word atomos means invisible, literally, because it is so tiny we can't see it. The typical size of an atom is thought to be between 1 and 5 Armstrongs. What's an Armstrong? It's 0.000000001 centimeters. You're talking about invisible, basically. It's the smallest particle of an element. Interestingly, it's not the smallest particle, period. It's the smallest particle of an element because the atom itself has parts. And those parts are obviously smaller than the total atom itself. There's protons, neutrons, electrons, and then even they have internal parts. And it seems like a bottomless pit. It seems like the more you look into it, the deeper you look, the more complexity you find. And it's just mind-boggling. But let's just keep it at the level of the atom. In such a tiny, tiny particle, there is an exact order of design. You have a nucleus with a balance of protons and neutrons, and you have a cloud of electrons. And there's atomic laws that regulate the proportions, the ratios of these parts, that regulate the orbit of the electron as it orbits the nucleus of the atom. And all of this is finely tuned, very orderly, and very regulated. Does that sound to you like something that happened by chance? I don't think so. I think design is obvious when you look at an atom. Now let's take the atom, and go one step further. How do these atoms even work for us? Well, what's the most common element on our planet? H2O. Absolutely, water. Interestingly, H2O means that water consists of 1 oxygen molecule and 2 hydrogen molecules. Now, if you look at this diagram, you'll notice that the oxygen molecule is bigger than the hydrogen molecules, because the oxygen molecule has its nucleus. Not only does it have a nucleus, but it has 2 rings, 2 levels of electrons that orbit it. The first has 2 electrons orbiting the nucleus, and then a bit further out from the nucleus, you have 6 electrons circling it. That's what an oxygen molecule looks like. Highly designed. But you know what? There's an atomic law that says that an element is not stable unless there are 8 electrons in the outer shell. That's an atomic law to make an element stable. So the oxygen molecule is 2 electrons short of being stable. Guess what? Hydrogen atoms only have 1 electron. So they're not stable at all. However, when 2 of them connect to the outer ring of oxygen, now you have a stable element called water. It is so stable that if it gets really, really cold, it freezes, but it stays together. And to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen, you have to boil the water. You have to take it to an incredible amount of heat to get it to separate the particles. So my question to you, does this look like something that happened by chance or by design? I see an intricate design. And by the way, this is elementary, this is remedial chemistry. This is not even touching upon what elements do as they combine with each other. Some combinations of elements are so elegant and so amazingly intricate, and they do such amazing things for us that it's hard to even fathom the level of design and the laws that regulate how all of these elements connect and interact with each other. The periodic table of elements, which, by the way, we continue to add elements to as we discover more elements, is one of those things that shows order, design, sequences, increases in electrons, in protons, in mass. It's just something that is structured. You see it. It's like finding an incredibly complicated book written by an incredibly complicated mind, intelligent mind, and saying, well, that just happened by chance. Somehow there was an explosion at a print factory and look what we got. No, it doesn't work that way. It is obvious that there's design. There's more examples. Let's think about human DNA. Let's go into the human body and find examples. In our body, there's approximately 100 trillion cells. Now that number varies because nobody has sat down and actually counted them. We do mathematical formulas to try to figure out how many. And that's why different biology books will give you anywhere from 100 trillion to 600 trillion cells in the human body. Some even have more or predict that there are more. But let's go with the lowest number, 100 trillion cells. Think about that. That number is huge. We can't think of 100 trillion anything. Our mind doesn't go that far. But each of those cells has 46 chromosomes, a complete complement of DNA, every one of those cells. And that DNA is 3 billion letters of highly detailed building instructions for life. So 3 billion characters in a strand of DNA in every one of our cells, 100 trillion cells. How much information is in our human body? We have more information in our body than all the libraries on the planet combined. Every one of us. Information. And so when you understand the complexities of DNA that this information is structured in words, in sentences, perfect syntax in order for it to be able to do what it does, paragraphs, chapters, it's just overwhelming evidence that this did not happen by chance. Each molecule of DNA, just to give you an idea of how much information it has the same amount of information as an entire set of encyclopedias. Now, I know that encyclopedias are a thing of the past. Our idea of an encyclopedia now is Google. But if you go to a library, ask the librarian, can I see your Encyclopedia Britannica? And if you've never seen it, it's a sight to see. You have 40, 50, 60 volumes of information. That's how much information is in every strand of DNA in every cell of 100 trillion cells in our body. Now, I'm sorry, but I don't have enough faith to believe that that happened by chance. That happened because it's absolutely designed. Information, as we've seen before, doesn't come from random, unguided processes. Information comes from intelligent minds. It's an example of design. Let me show you a video. I want you to watch this video clip and show you a little bit about what happens inside the cell, just so you get a feel for the design. It's an amazing, complex design of manufacturing and quality control. It's really mind-boggling. And I want you to watch this clip and just think about everything you're looking at and wonder if this is something that could happen by unguided processes. Watch this.
Closer to home, scientists have discovered a wealth of information within the nucleus of the living cell.
DNA has a structure that is ideal for carrying information. In the A's, T's, C's, and G's, the basis of the double helix of DNA, is the potential for storing a tremendous amount of information.
There is, in fact, no entity in the known universe that stores and processes more information more efficiently than the DNA molecule. A full complement of human DNA has 3 billion individual characters. Analysis of the DNA molecule's coding regions show that its chemical characters have a specific arrangement that allows them to convey detailed instructions or information, much like letters in a meaningful sentence or binary digits in a computer code.
Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a computer program, only much more complex than any we've been able to devise. And if you reflect on that even for a minute, it's a highly suggestive observation, because we know that Bill Gates does not employ wind and erosion or random number generators to generate his software. Instead, he employs intelligent engineers, software engineers. And so everything we know in our experience suggests that information-rich systems arise from intelligent design. But what do we make of the fact that there is information in life, in every living cell of every living organism? That's the fundamental mystery. Where does that information come from?
Where does that information come from? That is the question. See, when you look at the intricacies of DNA, the chemicals, how they bond with sugars, the way they're structured in pairs, the way that certain chemicals, certain letters cannot combine with others in the same pair. They only work with a certain letter. The way that helix is a double helix that tightly wound to compress the information. The access to the information, the reparation of DNA when a certain DNA molecule or strand of DNA gets damaged. I mean, everything about it speaks design, and not just any design, a brilliant engineer designing this. And so what happens inside the cell hundreds of times per minute is the manufacturing of proteins. It's one of the most amazing processes inside the cell, with the collaboration of workers, factories, materials. I mean, you have a very delicate process that produces incredible results, incredibly fast, and even with quality control. Watch the process with me. One more video, because I want you to see the actual process of how proteins are manufactured. It's called protein synthesis. Here we go.
In the years since Kenyon's rejection of chemical evolution, science has revealed the details of an entire system of information processing that bears the hallmarks of intelligent design. With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a 2-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, It is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the Earth.
Think about that for a minute, what you just saw. That happens hundreds of times inside your cell, and you're not even aware it's happening. Think about the intricacies of it. There's a machine that goes to, a molecular machine that goes to the DNA and unwinds it exactly where it needs to unwind it to find the exact instructions to manufacture the exact protein that is needed for that particular function. How does it know where to start and where to stop? Well, there's a librarian called the epigenome that tells them you copy from here to here. Super sophisticated. Then another molecule called messenger RNA comes and actually makes a copy. I mean, to use our terminology, he makes a photocopy. It's not really a photocopy, it's a chemical copy, but he makes a copy of that section, and then it leaves to go and work with that copy and follow those instructions. The DNA helix is sealed back up, ready to be accessed again when the next protein has to be manufactured in whatever section has to be opened for that event to happen. Then that information is taken into a machine that's called a ribosome that takes those instructions and implements it and connects a chain of amino acids that are later going to be folded. Now, when that chain is complete, it is transported by something called chaperones. Why? Because if it accidentally folds, you know, like when you have a strand of tape, you don't want the tape to touch itself because it'll stick and then you damage the piece of tape. Well, the same thing happens with the amino acids, so they have to be transported by chaperones at different parts in the chain to make sure it doesn't fold before time, and it's taken to a machine that does the folding. These are three-dimensional, highly complex, amino acid shapes that can be folded in dozens of ways, but only one way makes it work right for the protein. So it has to be folded perfectly. If it is folded wrong, quality control says this is not working, this protein won't work. We throw it away and we start again. That's how intricate it is. So the whole, and by the way, we're just looking at this on the surface. When you get into the details of molecular biology and biochemistry, what happens is 1,000,000 times more complicated than what we just saw. That's just like a layman's version of what occurs inside the cell. And you mean to tell me that this happened by chance? That all of this manufacturing and quality control and systems in place and workers and librarians and all of this just happened by chance inside the cell? Really? That's to me is ridiculous, absolutely. So that's the design argument. Every design implies a designer. The universe has a great design, therefore the universe has a great designer. And you can pick your own example of a design that you can become familiar with and use it. Now, what are the possible objections, real quick, to this argument? There aren't many, but I've heard them all over the years as I've used this argument. Here's one common objection. Well, I don't know about design because not all the designs are good. Look at viruses and bacteria and what they do. What kind of designer would design, organisms that are so damaging? Okay, let's stop and think about that for a minute. Viruses are very complex, incredibly complex metabolisms and organisms. These viruses, anybody who knows about viruses knows that they're nothing but incredibly designed. We might not like what they do, but that doesn't mean they're not designed. They're designed incredibly. Bacteria, we may not like what bacteria do because oftentimes we don't even understand what they do. But here's what we do know, they are incredibly designed. Very incredibly designed. So you see, this argument doesn't at all diminish the design or weaken the argument. This counter argument, the only thing it questions is, why would God do this? Why would the designer make this or that? And usually those questions stem from our lack of knowledge of why God does what he does. But it does in no way invalidate the argument. Another argument, a counter argument that I hear is that, well, you can have complexity without a designer. I mean, look at a snowflake under a microscope, and you're going to see the most incredibly complex design. And there was no designer. We know exactly how it happens in the atmosphere, unguided. And you say, well, you know what? You have a point here. And I agree. Complexity is not the only evidence of design. Complexity simply means something that is highly unlikely, highly improbable. If I took a box of alphabet cereal, one of my favorite cereals growing up as a kid was alphabet, because I would like to spell words with it. But let's take a box of alphabet cereals and you just spill the whole box on the floor. You're going to have an arrangement of letters on the floor that doesn't say anything, but you know what? It is very complex. Very complex. You can spill that box 1,000 times and you'll never get the exact same array of letters. Every time you do it, it's going to be super complex. But that doesn't necessarily show design, and that's not what we're talking about when we talk about design. Because that's not how DNA is. DNA isn't a random complex arrangement of letters. No, 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 no. DNA is more analogous to if I drop the box of Cheerios or the box of alphabet cereal on the floor, and then I look down and it says, "Good morning, Juan. I hope you enjoy your breakfast." Like, what? Wait a minute. Now we have complex information, but it's also specified information. So when we see specified complexity, there is no question that there's an intelligent mind behind it. If you're driving into a new city and you see that an arrangement of bushes that says, "Welcome to San Diego," you're not going to doubt for 1 second that a gardener took his time and trimmed those bushes and made them spell the words "Welcome to San Diego." You're not going to think that this is the product of just, random wind and erosion and fertilizer. No, because it is complex, but it is specified. It's telling you something. And the information in DNA is building instructions for life. This is not just a spilt box of alphabet cereals that just has random arrangement of letters. No, there's a specific message and a very, very specified and complex message. So that argument doesn't really cut it. Yes, there are things that are complex that are not necessarily designed. I agree, no problem. We can agree on that. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about DNA. There is absolute design there. Those are pretty much the arguments that could be raised against the design argument. We know of nothing in our universe that is designed that doesn't have a designer. That's the bottom line. So this is a highly effective argument that I recommend you use as often as you can. Become familiar with it. And so let's go on to the second argument, the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument has the basic idea that since there's a universe, it must have been caused by something beyond itself. Common sense again, okay? If the universe exists and it began to exist, there was a time when the universe did not exist. So it could not cause itself. It had to be caused by something outside of itself. Common sense. And it is based on the law of causality, cause and effect, which says that every limited thing is caused by something other than itself. Defining limited as something that has a beginning, something that doesn't have to exist, but does exist. Now, there are two different types of arguments, or two different forms to this argument, and a ton of variations by different philosophers. But one type of argument says that the universe needed a cause for its beginning, and that's what we are definitely going to look at, the cosmological argument. But there's a second variation, and that's that the universe needs a cause to continue to exist, a sustaining cause, not just a cause of its origin, but a cause of its sustenance. And so that's a second variation, which we're not going to really spend time on. So here's the argument from creation, the cosmological argument. The universe had a beginning. Anything that has a beginning has to be caused by something else. Therefore, the universe was caused by something else. Now, you may have seen it in a different format, different order. Some philosophers will put it in a different order and say, anything that has a beginning has to be caused by something other than itself. The universe had a beginning, therefore it was caused by something other than itself. But this is a very simple way to remember it. And just learn this argument. It is powerful in many ways. Now, how could people argue against it? Because again, nothing in our universe that began to exist caused itself. Nothing. Everything in our universe that began to exist was caused by something else. Okay? So, that is a very, very common sense argument. The law of causality is incredibly stable. We don't know of any effect that wasn't caused. So, what possible objections can people have to this argument? Now, this is unlike the design argument. This is not an argument where you defend it by examples. This is an argument where you defend it by responding to anyone who has objections to it. So what are some of the objections people have to this argument? Well, let's start with objections to the first premise. The universe had a beginning. What objections can be raised about that premise? Well, in order to avoid this conclusion, some people say that the universe is eternal. Never had a beginning. It just existed. They deny the first premise. No. The universe did not have a beginning. So can we really deny that? For centuries we did. Science did. But we live in a day and age now where that's not the case. The last bastion of that eternal universe was Carl Sagan, who's no longer with us. In his famous Cosmos series, he would say that the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. It's eternal, in other words. But he was proven wrong by science. Two ways to answer that objection. Number one, scientific evidence strongly supports the idea that the universe had a beginning. Even skeptics and atheists who do not benefit whatsoever by that concept, it only creates problems for their worldview, must admit that the universe had a beginning. The view that it was eternal was called the steady state theory, but that theory fell apart for many reasons. The theory of relativity that Einstein came up with, and all the evidence for a beginning, the fact that if it was eternal, it would be continuously having to produce hydrogen and helium from nothing. Just a lot of stuff that came together to say, you know what, this just doesn't hold water. This theory is not usable. It would be simpler to believe in a God that created the universe than to believe that it came from nothing, that it continuously creates hydrogen and helium from nothing in order to be able to exist or to come into existence. Now, the second way to respond to that objection is that the consensus of scientists studying the origin of the universe is that it came into being in a sudden cataclysmic way. And they've come to that conclusion by looking at the evidence. The main evidence that the universe had a beginning is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is running out of usable energy. Now think about it. If it's running out of usable energy, it could not be eternal because it already would have run out of usable energy. In other words, if something is running down, then it cannot be eternal. What is winding down must have been wound up at some point. We know that our universe is not eternal. Our sun is not eternal. Our sun is running out of energy. If it was eternal, it would have already run out of energy. Or it would never run out of energy. It would maintain a stable energy level throughout known human history. But that's not the case. We know that it's losing energy. All of this adds up to tell you, you know what? It's hard to sustain the view now that the universe or matter is eternal. And so other evidences for the beginning that we can still see is the background radiation. We can see the movement caused by an explosive beginning to our universe. Robert Jastrow, founder of the NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, said something really interesting here. Now, a sound explanation may exist for the explosive birth of our universe, but if it does, science cannot find out what that explanation is. The scientist's pursuit of the past ends at the moment of creation. What is he saying? He's saying, look, we scientists need something to observe in order to do science. So when there was nothing to observe, there was nothing for us to do as scientists. When it began, after creation, that's when we can start doing science. It's beyond our scope, our reach, to define how it began. That's not science. It's more philosophy, actually, than science, trying to figure out how it began. Beyond the scientific evidence that shows that the universe began, there's also a philosophical reason that the world needs a starting point. This argument shows that you cannot go back into the past forever. It's impossible to pass through an infinite series of moments. Now, this is high order thinking. I want to explain this to you, make sure we get this idea. Philosophers have known all along that the universe is not eternal. And they've known it because in order to be where we are today, there had to be a starting point. And we are that far from that starting point. If there is no starting point in the past, we would never be able to progress to where we are now. Think of a timeline. Let me illustrate it even easier. Okay? If there's a chicken, it came from an egg. But that egg came from a chicken. That came from an egg, that came from a chicken. If there is an infinite number of chickens and eggs, we would never have any chickens or eggs. You need to have a first chicken that laid its first egg to begin to exist and to bring us to the point that we are today. Let me use another analogy. If you go to a library shelf and you start fingering across the books and you get to the book, the 27th book on the shelf, you cannot get to that 27th book on the shelf unless you started. You have a first book in that shelf. If the list is endless of books, infinite, you could never come to this point because you would continue to go back, and never start to come this way. It's called an infinite regress. And philosophers know that it's impossible. There is no such thing as an infinite regress. And so there's philosophical evidence that the universe had a beginning. So it's impossible to sustain that matter and the universe is eternal. If the past is infinite, we could never pass through the infinite amount of time to get to where we are today. If the world never had a beginning, then we could never have reached today. And so, a second level of objections come with a second premise. So, the premise that the universe had a beginning, no objections can stand up to that. Now, what about the second premise? The idea that anything that has a beginning needs to be caused by something else. What objections could be raised on that? Well, only one prominent objection stands out. And that's the principle of initial cause only applies to things within the universe, but not to the universe itself. And this was presented by Anthony Flew, a former atheist that became a theist before he died. But he would argue and say, look, just because everything in our universe that begins to exist has to have a cause outside of itself, that doesn't necessarily mean that the universe also subjected to that rule. Okay. Technically, he might be right. It doesn't necessarily follow that the universe has to follow the law of cause and effect. But if everything inside the universe follows the law of cause and effect, everything, 100%, no exceptions, why would we believe that it doesn't apply to the universe? It is far more likely that it also applies to the universe. So he was really grasping on the straws when he gave this alternative. And honestly, if it's a possibility, it could be an objection. I just don't see it as a very strong objection at all because it goes contrary to everything we know. And by the way, if there is an exception to the rule and something can exist without a cause like the universe, then what's to say other things can't? What's to say that there are not other examples of it? Why can't we find other examples of it? And finally, let us consider the conclusion. How can anyone possibly object to the fact that because the universe began to exist and anything that begins to exist needs a cause, then there must be a cause for the universe? Well, what objections could be raised? There's two primary objections. The first one is that the universe is eternal. We've already dealt with that. And the second one is that the argument does not lead to God, but rather an unspecified agent. And again, that's not an objection. That's a statement. The fact that the argument doesn't identify who that cause is in no way invalidates the argument. In no way, because it's not even the intention of the argument. Before you can identify who God is or who the agent is that caused the universe, you need to first accept that there is such a being as an agent that caused the universe. And that's the point of the argument. Establish that there is evidence for a necessary being like God to have created the universe. To establish his identity, we need another argument, and that'll be another talk that we'll do. Which God? How do we know that the God of the Bible is the right one, the causal agent of the universe? We can address that at another occasion. But this argument does not address that, and this counter argument does not in any way invalidate it. So it's not a very strong argument. Now let's go to the third and final argument I want to share with you, and that's the moral argument, the axiological argument. It goes like this. First premise, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2, we live in a world where objective moral values do exist, therefore, God does exist. Now, I teach logic and philosophy, and we've done the truth tables and we've done the analogies. This is a perfectly valid, well-structured, sound argument. So any questioning of whether it's a circular reasoning or any accusation that it's a tautology or anything like that is unfounded. And if you want the evidence, you can just write us and we will send you the truth tables and we'll send you the proofs and show you that this is structured perfectly. If we have a problem, it's got to be with the content, not with the argument. The argument is well structured. And so, how do we deal with this? What are the objections? First of all, understand that this is common sense, okay? If there is no God, then there's no objective morality. Why? Because if there is no God, then who makes up morality? We do. We do. And then what makes my morality any better than your morality? If there is no God, then there's literally over 7 billion people establishing what is moral and what is not. It becomes absolutely subjective. It's whatever you think, whatever I think, whatever she thinks, whatever he thinks. So if there is no God, no authority above man to legislate morality for mankind, then objective morality does not exist. That's just a given. And so that's what leads a lot of atheists and skeptics to say that morality is subjective, relativism, moral relativism. Why? Because there is no God. So if there is no God, it's just us, and we decide for ourselves what we do. Everybody has their own choice. Don't judge me. We all do what we think is right and wrong. If you don't want to do it, fine, but I'm going to do it. So that's the bottom line there. Common sense. But is that the world we live in? No, it's not. It's not the world we live in, because we all know that there is this objective morality that transcends us. That transcends us. We all know this. So again, common sense tells us then there must be a lawgiver, a lawmaker. And just off the bat, somebody may say, well, that doesn't mean it identifies who it is. That doesn't mean it's the God of the Bible. It could be some other supreme being. Okay, yeah. The point is not to identify him, same as the last argument. The point is to establish that God is a necessary being. Identifying who it is, that's another argument. So let's evaluate this. The argument also follows the principle of causality. So makes it a strong argument. But moral laws are different from natural laws. Understand the difference. Moral laws are different than natural laws. Moral laws don't describe what is, they prescribe what ought to be. See, natural laws describe what is, but moral laws prescribe what ought to be. There's a big difference between those two terms. They're not simply a description of the way men behave. And by the way, I mean, if moral laws were based on how men behave, we would be in trouble. Absolutely. And they're not known by observing what we do. You can't come up with this code of moral laws by observing what we do, because what do we always do? Violate these laws. So it's not based on observation of our behavior. It's not even based on our behavior. If they were, our idea of morality would surely be different. Instead, they tell us what men ought to do, whether they're going to do it or not. If we were the ones making this objective moral law, what would it look like? Seriously, would anybody make a code of law that they themselves could not fulfill? No, that'd be ludicrous. If I'm in charge of making the laws around here, I'm going to make laws that I am sure I can follow. But the moral code established on our universe is hard to follow for all of us. That tells us right there that we did not come up with it. It's not our idea. So does any moral ought comes from beyond the natural universe. Nothing in nature is going to tell you how you ought to behave. It must be something supernatural, something that transcends the natural world. You can't explain it by anything that happens in the universe, and it can't be reduced to things that men do in the universe. It transcends the natural order and requires a transcendent cause. Now, let's look at each premise and see what people object to. First premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values don't exist. What objections could be raised? Well, some may say that there doesn't have to be a supreme lawgiver. Evolution can account for the sense of morality we all share. That's a common answer. You will get that answer from a lot of people. Now, it's not the most common. The most common answer I get is, well, I'm an atheist and I live a moral life, so I don't need a God to tell me what's right and wrong. I live a moral life. That's not what we're saying. Of course, there are atheists that live more moral lives than some Christians I know. But here's the point. Where did you get the code? Who established that code of morality? It was not you. You subject yourself to this code of morality, but in order to do so, you have to steal that code from God, the same God you deny exists. That's why my friend Frank Turek wrote a book called Stealing from God, in which he breaks down how to be an atheist in this world, we have to borrow from God's laws, from God's provisions, from God's abundant blessings, in order to be able to sustain our belief that he does not exist. It's like stealing from God. That's the idea. So let's consider one version of this evolution is what gives us morality. And that's in the words of my favorite atheist, Richard Dawkins. In a debate he had when he wrote The God Delusion, he debated John Lennox, one of my favorite apologists from Oxford University. And the two of them had an amazing debate. But I'm going to show you a clip of the debate where Richard Dawkins explains how morality can come about without God. And then let's see if his arguments really can hold any water. Watch this with me.
To say the least. Now, you might say that forces me into a challenge. How do I know what's moral? Well, I don't on the whole, but the point I want to make is that there does seem to be a kind of universal human acceptance that certain things are right and other things are not. If you look cross-culturally, look at anthropological findings on different cultures, you'll find there's a kind of agreement that certain things are wrong and other things are right. There's disagreement in detail. The golden rule, do as you would be done by. Do unto others what you would expect them to do to you. This is a very, very widespread principle, and it almost amounts to common sense in a way. You certainly don't need a holy book in order to tell you to do that. Now, as an evolutionist, I think that it comes partly from our evolutionary past. I think that there was a time in our history when we lived in small kin groups, and we lived in small groups where good deeds could be expected to be reciprocated, and under those conditions we developed a kind of lust to be good, which was parallel to the lust for sex, which has obvious Darwinian advantages. Now, we no longer live in small villages, in small clans, and so the Darwinian pressure to be good is no longer so strong, nor is the Darwinian pressure for lust as strong as it once was, because nowadays we often use contraceptives and therefore sexual behavior does not lead to the reproductive consequence, which is of course the Darwinian reason for it. But that doesn't matter. The point is that our evolutionary past built into us a lust for sex, and by the same token it built into us a lust to be good, a lust to be friendly, a lust to cooperate, a lust to be sympathetic towards suffering. So I think it partly comes from that, but it also comes from something less easy to define, but which is clearly there, because I call it the shifting moral zeitgeist. It's something that changes from decade to decade. Living as we do in 2007, there will be a broad consensus of what's right and wrong. Racism is wrong, sexual discrimination is wrong, cruelty is wrong, which characterize we who live in the early 21st century, which would not necessarily have characterized our ancestors in this place 200 years ago. The consensus has moved on, and I find this a very interesting, fascinating fact, which suggests that there really is a kind of something in the air about what is regarded as moral. And it clearly has nothing to do with religion, because it doesn't come from Scripture. Scripture doesn't change over the decades in the way that our attitudes to slavery, our attitudes to women, etc. do. There really does seem to be a powerful shifting zeitgeist effect, which doesn't tell you anything in itself, but which indicates that there is something in the air, some other force, something which we can understand with sufficient sociological, psychological sophistication. Whatever else it is, it's not religion.
There is so much to unpack there. We could spend the next 7 hours on that. But let me just give you some quick highlights of what he said. First, he says that there seems to be a kind of universal human acceptance, that's cross-culturally and anthropologically, a kind of agreement that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. By saying that, what he's saying is objective morality exists. That's exactly what he's saying. There seems to be this idea that across cultures that everybody kind of figures out that some things are right and some things are wrong. Amen, Richard. That's exactly true. That's how it happens. He says it almost amounts to common sense. You don't need a holy book to tell you that. Okay, I agree. You don't need the Bible to tell you that because it's written in our hearts. And it is common sense only because our conscience continuously tells us and reminds us, you cannot do this. Don't do that. It's wrong to do that. So this idea that you don't need a holy book, I'll grant that, because for a long time we didn't have no Bible. It wasn't until the 17th, 16th century when the printing press was done that people actually got Bibles. But killing has been wrong since the Garden of Eden. Cain did not have to read a Bible to know that what he did to his brother Abel was wrong. Adam and Eve didn't need a Bible to know that what they had done to God was wrong. They hid. In other words, it is written in our hearts. Now, the fact that God took his time to put it down in writing for us just goes to show that if it's not in writing, we find our way around it. We figure out ways of not doing what is right. But when it's codified, when it's written, then you're pretty much committed to that code and to that type of behavior. Then he says moral laws come at least in part from our evolutionary past. Now, before I go further on that, think about this for a minute. From evolutionary past, really, what does evolution teach? Survival of the fittest. I remember in a debate in 2014 where I used that and I said, if we get morality from evolution, what's that morality going to look like? It's going to look like survival of the fittest. The strong are going to kill the weak so that they could use their resources and get stronger. The weak, no compassion. And it's funny because one of the comments that somebody tweeted after the debate was that I did not understand evolution because evolution doesn't teach the survival of the fittest. And I'm like, hello, it's an entire chapter in the origin of the species. Darwin wrote an entire chapter on it, and you're telling me it's not Darwinian evolution? Now, that modern evolutionists may not believe that's the case anymore. Amen. They're finally learning something about what Darwin did not get right. But it is definitely a part of what he taught. And so what Richard is saying here is pretty interesting. He says, in small kin groups, we developed a lust to be good, like the lust for sex. Really? Do you know anyone that has a lust to be good? I mean, yeah, I guess there are some philanthropists out there. But evolution doesn't teach us a lust to be good. Evolution teaches us there's one piece of chicken and there's two of us. I want to survive, so I'm going to kill you so I can eat the chicken. That's what evolution, there's not a lust to be good, a lust to, you can have my chicken, I'll starve to death because I just want to be a nice guy. That's not what evolution teaches us. Absolutely not. And this one blew me away here. I don't know where Richard lives, but it must be a really boring neighborhood. Because listen to what he says. We no longer live in small villages and clans, and the Darwinian lust to be good diminishes, as has the Darwinian lust for sex. Yep. Haven't you noticed how the Darwinian lust for sex has diminished? Really? Dude, I don't know where you live, man, but in my neck of the woods, the Darwinian lust for sex has not diminished. Not whatsoever. And so our evolutionary past has built into us a lust for sex, as did a lust for good. It also comes, now listen to this one, it also comes from something less simple to describe, a shifting moral zeitgeist. The consensus has changed with time, unlike the Bible, because the scripture does not change. What is he implying? The Bible is outdated. Morality has shifted over time. It's hard to describe, but the Bible is so static, it's like outdated. Let me ask you something, because Ted Turner from CNN said one time that, you know, the Bible is outdated, the Ten Commandments are outdated, we need a new moral code. And my question would be to him, which part of thou shalt not kill is outdated? Please explain to me. Which part of thou shalt not steal is outdated? Which part of thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife is outdated? I mean, give me a break. These moral codes are standard and they do not flex and they do not change because they're not based on a calendar, they're based on the character of God. It's wrong because it's against what God's character stands for. And God does not change. So these moral codes will not change. And so yes, our culture has changed, but every time our culture changes its morality, it changes it away from what is right to what is wrong. And like Isaiah says in chapter 5 and verse 20, they call what is good bad and what is bad good. They turn everything upside down. Yes, that is happening, but that does not mean that an objective moral law does not exist. It means that some people, many people, choose to ignore and disobey that objective morality. He goes on to say that there seems to be a kind of something in the air. I love that. There seems to be something in the air with regards to what is right and wrong, and it clearly has nothing to do with religion. So it's something in the air and you don't know what it is, but even though you don't know what it is, you know that it's not from religion. I find that an interesting statement. Then he says there's something in the air, some other force which we cannot understand, but whatever it is, it's not religion. You see his continuous emphasis here? There's something in the air, there's something we cannot explain. It's another force. Please, Richard, explain to me what you mean by a force. Please, try to explain somehow what you mean by a force in the air. You know what I call that force in the air? The Holy Spirit. That's what I call that force in the air. There is something. You're absolutely right. You don't know what it is. I do. Let me help you. This is what it means. Now, in that debate, John Lennox he hit it out of the park. All right. I'm going to show you a brief clip of how he responded to Richard, because it is priceless. Listen to his words.
In the image of God. So what I would want to say is this: of course, we can be good without God in the sense of our personal behavior. But I'm not sure whether we can find foundations for the concept of being good without God. You admit that you cannot get ethics from science. In your book, A Devil's Chaplain, science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. And I find it very interesting, reading one of your other books, River Out of Eden, to find what I understand is your analysis of what the universe is like at bottom. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now that seems to me to be saying that good and evil don't exist, so I don't even know where you get the moral criteria to discuss it. If a rock falls off a mountain onto your head and kills you, it makes no sense calling the rock evil. It just exists. If Pol Pot chooses to eliminate 1 million intellectuals, or the 9/11 terrorists choose to fly hundreds of people to their deaths into the Twin Towers, how can you call them evil if they were simply dancing to their DNA? Now that strikes me as a hideous world you're delivering us into that has no morality at all. And so therefore, just pushing this a little bit further, if good and evil don't exist, there is no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, how can it possibly make sense to talk of the evils of religion or of the good of atheism? Now, I know that you suggest elsewhere that we have to rebel against our genes, but that creates, to my mind, an immense problem with what you say, because if we are nothing but our genes and dancing to the tune of our DNA, what part of us can rebel against them? So I want to suggest this, that far from atheism delivering an adequate explanation for morality, it dissolves it. And it's a problem that's been around for centuries. How can something mindless and impersonal like the universe impose a sense of morality upon us? And David Hume, a philosopher whom you quote, pointed this out very clearly. He said, you just cannot get an ought from an is. You cannot derive morality and ethics from matter and energy. You cannot go from facts to values. And what concerns me greatly is that, although you don't say it in your book, is that this kind of philosophy that has no base for morals in a transcendent God has got to find morality either in raw nature or a combination of nature and society, and often leads to a kind of utilitarianism. And we are in serious ethical confusion, I think, in our contemporary world, in the legal sphere, in the ethical, in the medical sphere, and in the business sphere, because the foundations are crumbling. And I want to suggest, I know it's provocative, but I want to suggest that Dostoevsky was very perceptive, and I've had many Russians agreeing with me, when he said, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. He's not saying that people can't be good. He's saying that the foundations of morality are removed. And Nietzsche predicted exactly the same thing.
Now, Lennox's comments require no editorializing. I mean, he is right on the money. He completely destroys the view that's presented by Dawkins. Another view that's antagonistic to morality coming from God comes from another atheist named Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a philosopher, a scientist, a PhD, young guy, brilliant. He's written several books. And he says that evolution is the supreme lawgiver. So yeah, there is this law, but we don't need God. Evolution is the supreme lawgiver. Now, in a radio interview, he said something very interesting. And I'm going to quote what he said, because this is the kind of morality you get from evolution. I applaud him for his honesty. I applaud him for taking evolutionary ethics and morality to its logical conclusion, as shocking as that may be. Because if there is no God and evolution produced morality, what he is saying now would be an acceptable perspective for everybody, because that's what evolutionary has established as morality. Here's what he says. He says, if I had a magic wand and could completely eliminate rape or religion, without hesitation, I would eliminate religion. Wow, stop. I mean, does he have a mother, a sister, a girlfriend, a wife? I mean, are there any women in his life? Are you seriously saying that rape is less hurtful and damaging than religion? That you would do away with religion and leave rape? Yes, exactly what he's saying. He explains when the radio interviewer presses in on him, he says the following. There's nothing more natural than rape. Humans rape, chimpanzees rape, orangutans rape. Obviously, rape is part of evolution's strategy for assuring your genes are transferred to the next generation. Wow. That's morality derived from evolution. But that's not the morality of the world we live in, because everyone knows that rape is wrong. Everyone knows that rape is wrong across cultures. Whether people obey that moral objective law or not, it's still wrong, and everyone knows it. So, objective moral values do exist. Premise number 2. How do people object to that? Well, some might say that moral law is not really objective. It's just subjective. It doesn't really exist. Come on, you think it's objective, but it's not. It's just a matter of opinion. It is nothing but a subjective judgment that comes from social conventions. People say that. However, this view fails to account for the fact that all men hold the same things to be wrong, like murder, rape, theft. If societies across the world develop their own social conventions, they come to agree upon what they all should live, how they should all live their lives, then we would have different moralities in different parts of the world. That's not the case. Across the globe, across cultures, across time, you have people agreeing that there are some things that are just wrong, period. And has nothing to do with our social conventions. Also, this criticism sounds very much like a subjective judgment, because they're saying that our value judgments are wrong. So wait a minute. If this is subjective and you're saying that I'm wrong, that's just your opinion. If there's no objective moral law, then there can be no right or wrong value judgments. If our views of morality are subjective, so are theirs. And we end up getting nowhere. But if they claim to be making an objective statement about moral laws, then they are implying that there is a moral law in the very act of trying to deny it. Finally, we find that even those who say that there is no moral order expect to be treated with fairness and courtesy and dignity. Everyone expects others to follow some moral code, even those who try to deny they exist. And finally, the conclusion, therefore, there has to be a God. What possible objections? Where there's 2 common objections. Man can be the supreme lawgiver, right? Or, if there is such a lawgiver, it's not necessarily the God of the Bible. Again, I agree. This argument doesn't identify who it is, it simply establishes the need. So there you have it. There's a case for God's existence. 3 arguments: the argument from design, the argument from creation, and the argument from morality. Pick one or learn all of them. Become familiar with them and use them, because these are useful cases, useful arguments. Each of these arguments on its own is powerful. The cumulative case of all 3 arguments is more powerful. Those are the tools we need to be able to respond to an incredulous, skeptical, atheistic world that wants to deny the existence of God and demands a reason for the hope that we have. Demands an argument to show that God does exist. There you have it. I'm Dr. Juan Valdes with Reasons for Hope.